everyone. Welcome to the 181st episode of the Spiritual Brainstorm. It's going to be a very long episode, actually, because, I've been watching all these predictions for 2024, 2026, a very big transition period for humanity, lots of crazy stuff going on. And many of these videos are about predictions. Many of these videos are also very general or generic, meaning they'll say that we're about to process the shadows and the fears and blah, 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 and blah, blah, blah. But I like the adage, if you want to predict the future, the best way is to create it. So obviously I'm going to talk a little bit about predictions, but also a lot, and mostly my video will focus on a path towards a future that I envisage that is one possible timeline, because there's just many, as typically as usual. But I'll explain a little bit later why I prefer or I choose to view things in a certain manner. So first of all, let's start with predictions. So, this is going to be a bit painful, but never mind. Let's put this, where should I put it? Maybe up here, right? What about there? Might be a bit annoying, but we'll see. So the first thing I wanted to address is fractals. What is this 2024, 2026 craziness? So if you look at humanity, let's say humanity, just consider it's one global superorganism, made up of humans as its cells. Many people call it the collective unconscious. There's just many terminologies for this. This transition that we are having, can't we look at this fractal pattern to sort of give it a certain meaning? And in our own human lives, there are key transition points in our own lives that can be interesting here. Birth is one. Teenager to young adult is one as well. Then there are other transitions that are very interesting, from gas to star, from molecules to living cell. And taken together, these different transitions can be very very interesting to look at, to understand what is happening to us, what we're actually experiencing. So the first one is birth, and there are many parallels here that are very interesting, that mimic they go back to, many people are talking about the fact that we are experiencing the birth of humanity, basically, as a collective global superorganism. And in birth, there are several things that are important, that are interesting. Energy transition, and growth. So the first one is energy transition. While you're still in your mother's womb, you're consuming energy in an unsustainable way. That is, you're feeding off of your mother's blood. You're taking much more energy than your mother can renew, because obviously, so certain women can have deficiencies in proteins, minerals, vitamins, and all kinds of things, because towards the end of pregnancy, because of how much the baby is sort of taking in. There's also one interesting here is pollution. The baby pees more and more in the womb, and the placenta doesn't manage to recycle the amniotic fluid fast enough, and so the baby ends up bathing in more pee than amniotic fluid and runs the risk of poisoning him or herself if he stays in the womb too long, because there's no more amniotic fluid at some point, and it's just like swallowing pesticides and plastics at our level of reality. Again, look at this fractal. So the energy transition, you're fed via the umbilical cord, your mother's blood, so your fossil fuels, all this non-renewable kind of energy. And then once you're born, the umbilical cord is cut, and now suddenly you have access to infinite energy via your lungs. Now that can take many forms. I believe that it will be something like nuclear fusion, because that's just the direction we're heading. It could be anything else, like pulling energy from the void, all kinds of experimental technologies. But that's besides the point. It's not about the form, it's about the logic, the fractal logic that's just repeating. Now, in terms of growth, well, the baby basically, while still inside the womb, grows exponentially. And then towards the end of pregnancies, in some countries where you let the baby stay even over their term, it can go a little bit like this. Like the organs sort of are more get perfected, but there isn't any new mass that the baby accumulates. It's more like perfection on what's already been there. And then once the baby is born, then you have a kind of an S curve here, where it doesn't grow at the same pace. So it goes like this, and then this is kind of birth, and there's an inflection point where the baby stops growing at the same rate as inside the womb, because obviously you went from weighing almost nothing to weighing 9 or 10 pounds. Imagine if in 9 months, so imagine if you sustained that growth level or rate while still outside the womb, and so we'd all weigh like several tons, right? So there's a clear S curve here in terms of growth, and that's what many post-growth economists are calling for. It's just that this is a natural pattern, and you can find it everywhere in nature. Like, for instance, if you look at a plant, the way that it grows is exactly the same. Like, you have this sprout where there's this initial burst in terms of energy consumption and growth, and then it sort of levels off, and then there's a plateau, and then it's sort of like a tree, for instance. It would grow very quickly in the first phase, and then there's an inflection point, and then it sort of levels off, or even decreases in terms of growth, because at a certain point it reaches maturity and there's no growth anymore. And so these are natural patterns that you find in nature, and it's just about navigating these patterns, well, in a way that is devoid of drama, because we're all about like, oh my God, we're gonna stop growing, this can be terrible. But it's a totally different logic. And if you think of especially the human experience, where pre-birth, it's steady growth, steady and continuous growth, which is the capitalist, debt-based monetary system is perfect for that, because in order to serve interests on debt, you have to keep on producing more and more and more. And so it gives this kind of stable, artificial rhythm to the economy, which has to grow at a steady pace. But once you're outside the womb, then circumstances change all the time and fluctuate all the time. You're no longer in this protective barrier where it's 37 degrees and you have unlimited food and resources. Suddenly sometimes you're fed, sometimes you're not fed, sometimes it's cold, sometimes it's warm, and sometimes you're very active as an organism, sometimes you're sleeping. And so all of that means that energy fluctuates all the time, whereas here, while still outside the womb, you had a steady influx and more energy being drawn. And so that signals a big transition. In terms of pollution, I think I already addressed that. I mean, basically you transition from a space where you're polluting the womb and you're poisoning yourself to a situation where your excrements can be easily dealt with in the new reality that you're in. So once the baby's outside the womb, then there's no problem. You can deal with the pee and the poo and all that stuff. You can go and shit in the fields. I don't know. But But while it's inside the womb, the baby, if it lets out its first feces while still inside the womb, the baby's basically dead because it's going to end up, suffocating. And so it's this idea that we have to find a way where our excrements as humanity are digested in much more easily, basically, recycled. And that's not possible while the baby is still inside the womb. It is possible once the baby is outside the womb. And so, but obviously this is all symbolic. So, we can sort of fantasize here science fiction, but imagine if at some point our electronic waste becomes food for sentient AI robots. And they actually feed on that. Like they would go into the dump, and they'd like take an old TV and then start eating it. And, they have special, little mini factories inside their bodies, which decompose all the electronic elements in order to repair their broken circuitry or and all that stuff. And obviously, you might think this is ridiculous, but ultimately that's what your bodies do, and that's what nature does. It's basically one species' excrements is another species' food. So your feces is food for the plants and earthworms and whatnot, and bugs and insects and plenty of other living creatures. So it's kind of trying to replicate that same kind of logic, but with humanity and what we produce as waste. And that's not even just material waste, because that's one side, but humanity produces a new kind of waste, which is this kind of waste. Stupid negative thoughts, all kinds of, non-digested emotions and psychic traumas and all that stuff. And, that's also waste, but it's not visible waste, but it is waste. And that also needs to be recycled in some way. So that's for the birth kind of metaphor. Now, teenager to young adult is a very interesting one because there are several scales here. So you have one scale is the relationship of the baby to its mother. So the mother is kind of like represents kind of nature or this external kind of boundary. And the baby is inside and is being nurtured via the mother directly. Once you're outside, then it's your parents that are the mediators between society's resources. So let's just put it this way. When you're still in the womb, your mother is like this meta thing. It's where your resources come from. And then you have the placenta, which is the intermediary organ between you and your mother's resources as a baby. Then the next fractal is society, parents, child. Then the next fractal is nature, governments, society. So basically, when you're in your mother's womb, you have access to your mother's resources via the placenta, which is a centralized organism which determines what resources you can draw, right, or access. Once you're outside the womb, then your parents are kind of like the new placenta or a centralized authority which serves as an intermediary between the society's resources and you as a child. As a child, you cannot walk into the supermarket and grab stuff and exit the supermarket. You need your parents to do that. So without your parents, you're basically screwed. It's not as, simple as that, but let's just say it is, from simplicity's sake. Obviously today, in our societies, society will find you other parents if you don't have any, you go into an orphanage or whatever. But you get the general idea. Then the next fractal above is, society has to go through governments as a kind of a placenta or centralized authority to access nature's resources. If you want to exploit the land, if you want to build a house, if you want to, dig a hole or transform the landscape or whatever, you have to apply for construction permits, you have to have a property title, you have to respect the laws. So you can't do whatever you want. And this is not true in every society, but it's just say that as this fractal, as we move more and more in terms of our evolution, this becomes more and more clear. And eventually, what's interesting is the relationship of the child to the parents. Well, the baby to the placenta obviously changes. So, you cut your umbilical cord once you're born. So your relationship to your mother changes completely at that point. And as a child, when you move from becoming a teenager to being a young adult, you move out from their home. So it's like cutting the umbilical cord a second time. And now you are in society directly, and governments are now your daddy or your parents, so to speak, in order to access nature. And then society, when it, like in our current representative democracies, our societies are at the symbolic stage of being a teenager. That is, society as a whole is a teenager. That is, we love to complain, criticize our governments. We are always in the power struggles and manifest and want more rights, want more freedom, want more this and that, and social rights and employment benefits and blah, blah, blah. And we're in this power kind of relationship, and the governments, sometimes play tough love, which is, the kind of anti-woke, go and get your own pocket money and, find a job. I'm not going to give you any pocket money, and you have to be home by 10 and blah, blah, blah. Or the, leftist nanny state kind of, extreme, where like the parents say, oh, you want your pocket money here? Here's a pocket money. Oh, you want to go and party until 3 a.m. and then I'll go and pick you up at 3 a.m. Yes, of course, I'll do that for you. I love you so much. And those are just two styles of parenting, one is not necessarily better than the other, but there always arrives a moment where the teenager becomes a young adult and leaves his the parental nest. And then he fends off, he's self-governing himself, basically. So that transition is away from centralized governments, which are kind of the placenta of society, you could say, and an intermediary between nature and society, and a society that can self-govern. And these transitions, why am I rambling on about all this, is that this whole thing about 2024, 2026 being a wild ride and, being all kinds of terrible political things happening and wars and blah, blah, blah. Well, the process of moving from being a teenager to a young adult can happen in so many different ways. Like in some cases, it happens very smoothly and you just move out of your parents' home and they help you out a little bit. And in some others, it's like a real power struggle and you have to fight your parents on the way out, and they're saying, no, you're not ready, you will never be ready, blah, 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 you're still immature. And so you run away and then you do all kinds of crazy stuff, and then maybe you go back there for a couple of months, and then you exit your parents' home again and you try again to be independent. And because humanity so far is still obsessed with heroes, the hero's journey, and drama, that's why there is little likelihood that, or little focus on the timeline, which would be a smooth sailing. Because let's face it, when we watch movies, do we watch the ones where everything is fine, everything is nice, and there's nothing happening? Or do we watch the ones where there's terrible drama and then the hero overcomes all these terrible obstacles and then finally triumphs at the end, being so strong? And so, at some point the universe is like, oh, okay, that's what humanity wants, right? They want drama. Well, let's give them drama then. And then you have all these governments that are corrupt and the World Economic Forum that wants to control everybody with AI and blah, 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 blah. What do you want? That's what entertains you. And so you're sending a signal to the universe saying, yay, this is fun, when you're watching a Netflix series and there's all kinds of crap happening. And then in reality, when that happens, you're like, oh my God, this is so terrible. And so the universe is like, well, pick your side, idiot. Do you want things to be, crazy and drama, or do you want this to be smooth? Your choice, right? And then finally, gas to star, molecule to living cell. Becoming a superorganism, it's like the planet becoming self-aware. It's like we're reaching this threshold where it's not just a simple transition as this. It's like the moment where from a bunch of unicellular organisms, the first pluricellular organism sort of clicks into place and starts functioning as a whole is a really, really magical concept. The moment the moment where a loosely, assembled gas or condensed gas of hydrogen bursts into flames and becomes a star, it's transcendence. It's reaching a completely different level, completely different functioning. Like it's just a completely different thing altogether. And the same for like having a bunch of amino acids, proteins, and things that are like molecules that are loosely related to each other is completely different from a living cell forming a coherent boundary where all of that chemistry inside of it is functioning in a way that you can't call it chemistry anymore. It's something beyond chemistry. And so that's the kind of level we're at. We've gone through all these fractals, but at some point, what's happening now with humanity being born, quote unquote, is much more, how should I say, magical or important or this transition is much, much stronger or sophisticated than just leaving your parents' house and living on your own. Still, I mean, there's some things you can relate, right? Like when you're a baby and you're in your mother's womb, like reality from your perspective at that point is tiny. It's just not much. There's like sounds and weird things happening you don't really understand, and things seem like they're random, and none of the sounds make sense because they're all muffled. And then you're in a reality where suddenly, wow, there's like all these advanced other civilizations of or organic beings that are out there that you did not perceive before, or that you couldn't perceive from your, and I'm not talking from the baby's kind of soul perspective or whatever. I'm talking from the baby's emerging human psyche, right? So for that psyche, it's just in a weird, self-enclosed, tiny little environment, and none of the sounds from the outside make sense. They're random, as random as cosmic radiation or solar flares from our perspective. Whenever, like, imagine, like, for instance, let's say a passerby shouts at your mother and she has like a spout with someone, and you as a baby inside the womb, your soul obviously understands what's going on, but your developing baby psyche or the biological element of yourself doesn't understand what's happening. Its environment is completely shifted because there's a lot of hormones and all the kinds of stuff that are released in the bloodstream that reflect the mother's mood or emotions that she's going through. And so if she has some kind of fight or problems or whatever, it's going to affect the baby. It's just that it doesn't understand. It cannot give a form to what has actually happened. It's just a bunch of chemical cocktails that are, inside of him, and the psyche is not ready yet to process what has happened. And so it gives it a weird kind of explanation, which can then become something like, Sodom and Gomorrah, and, God was angry because original sin, or I don't know, all kinds of crazy explanations, right? And the same here, like the sun sneezes in our direction, a solar flare, all our electric grids, shut down, and all kinds of crazy things happen on Earth. And we're like, whoa, well, that's just a random kind of occurrence or whatever. No, there's actually some kinds of things happening at another dimension that we can perceive, that we experience subjectively as a solar flare and all these kind of problems that affect us in a certain way, like we're affected by all of this. We just think that it's random and physical and mechanical because we just don't have because we're stubborn, basically. It's like the baby saying, yeah. Everything that's happening in the outer reality, all of these, sounds and this muffled sounds and all that stuff and all these different chemical things happening in this womb, that's all random. It's just, it just happens, it's like a cataclysm or something, but once you're outside, then you sort of, you gradually acquire the ability to navigate much more complex cause and effects. Like, for instance, she had an abusive husband and that's why she is abused domestically and that's why she is hit at this point because she said this and that annoyed him and he was, and he drank alcohol and blah, blah, blah. And you can make these causal relationships very complex. Once you're outside the womb and you start developing your psyche and start living as a human after a couple of years. But as an 8-month-old baby, you're clueless as to what's happening in terms of your developing psyche again, and the biological element in you, or the biological creature that's living in you, from your body's perspective, let's say. And it's the same for humans. Like, imagine that humans are each one a cell in a global superorganism. That superorganism's soul, quote unquote, like humanity's collective soul, you could say, that understands exactly what's happening and what's. But for us humans individually, we're like, what the hell is going on, right? I guess that summarizes the context of why we're living these transitions, 2024, 2026, and why everybody's talking about difficult times ahead and all that stuff. Birth can be a painful process. And it requires some adjustments. There's some shocks involved. If you cut the umbilical cord abruptly, you have to switch from one energy system very abruptly to another. So that can take many forms. It can mean peak oil. It can mean the collapse of the financial system. I mean, there's just so many symbolic forms it can take. Like, for instance, your parents that say from the moment you leave their house, okay, that's it. You have no more pocket money, and then suddenly you have to live off of your try to quickly find a job and fend for yourself. So all of these stories are basically this kind of fractal underpinning for what we're replicating now on the outside. And we still have a choice as to how to experience this. It's just that, well, first of all, each human has to decide which way they want to experience it, because no two people will experience it in the same way. Just like COVID, some people actually were already in living in the countryside and didn't really feel like there was anything going on much, and were quite happy living. And some other people, they were in a 1-bedroom apartment and going crazy in the middle of the city. And so no two people live these kinds of global events in the same way. And so what's important is to find out what you want to experience individually as a human and work on yourself. Because once you resolve certain number of things and you want to experience this transition smoothly, then maybe that kind of experience or that kind of timeline will open up for you. And what I meant to say also is that obviously, with the whole aliens and first contact kind of thing, well, when the baby is born, it's a global civilization of cells, right? You could say that that's what it is, a baby. And once it's outside the womb, it suddenly encounters other global civilizations of cells that are super advanced, right? Like the doctor, the midwife, the mother. All of these are like very advanced biological beings compared to itself, because it's like very basic, can't even move, can't even do much things. And so, but the important thing is here to understand that we're not meant to copy any of them. We're not meant to be inferior to any of them. We are like, to give you a metaphor, it's almost like imagine you have a swamp in which you have unicellular organisms that develop up to a point where they decide to come together and form a global collective organism that crawls out of the swamp. And imagine if in that swamp, there are plenty of collective global organisms that have been born from it. A lizard, a snake, a frog. But now the swamp really, really wants to focus hard and create the first chimps. And these cells and the organisms like sort of try to get together to form the chimpanzee, and the chimpanzee is not quite yet mature enough yet. It's almost done in terms of the organism, and it starts perceiving these other creatures that came to watch what was happening in the swamp, because like the frog and the lizard and the snake, they're like, wow, something's bubbling up and stirring up in that swamp. I wonder what it is. And then the monkey crawls out, pops his head out, like with, looks with one eye that's like almost formed, and then sees these super advanced creatures, because it is still maturing. It is not perfected yet as a global collective organism. It perceives the lizard as like this finite, well-rounded, functioning global organism as being superior to it. And it's like, and it says, ooh, dear lizard, give me wisdom, give me knowledge. And the lizard says, so in order to crawl, for instance, you have to go like this, And what you can do is you can, warm up on the rock face and stay in the sun and stay immobile for hours and hours. And the chimp's like, wow, yeah, that's amazing. And then tries, once he crawls out of the swamp, tries to imitate the lizard and doesn't really go very well. Well, obviously, because he has completely different powers, quote unquote, as a global collective organism than the lizard. And so that's a kind of a problem that I see with many channelers that channel Pleiadians or Arcturians or all kinds of other ET species that try to absolutely gain insight on their technology, their advanced technology, to mimic it on Earth and do the same because they're so advanced and they know everything. But no. The idea is we've been designed as humanity in a way that is very, very specific. And the idea is not to shed all our limiting beliefs about materialism, science, and religion, and all of these, stupid belief systems. It is to integrate them as almost like organs or zones in a developing brain, and saying, wow, this is a unique way to navigate and experience reality. It just requires harmonization and integration. And that's all. And not blindly copying what some other advanced ET races have been doing. The only thing that is worth copying is harmony. That is, the chimpanzee looks at the lizard and says, your stomach isn't trying to eat your intestines. Interesting. You're not poking yourself in the eye with your own hand. I'll try to do the same, right? So that's the only real source of inspiration that we should get. And ultimately, that's what most channelers channeling ETs will say. They will say, you're loved, you should be love and love each other and love, which is what? Which is basically, like what you do with your body, right? It's always an expression of love. You're not poking yourself with your own finger. You're not kicking yourself in the ass. You're not stabbing yourself. I mean, you're behaving to yourself like different parts of your body are behaving to other parts of your body in a loving way. So that's already a very long introduction, and that's the whole fractal issues. Now I just wanted to go into the future. What could the future look like? First point is the relative theory of money. And this ties directly with this idea of, the placenta, cutting the umbilical cord, or governments and fiat money, the debt-based monetary system, And all of these kind of need to go, obviously, because once you're on the outside, you're no longer fed by the placenta. or at least not for very long. I mean, there's this super practice that's called lotus birth, where you keep the placenta attached, and you let the last kind of minerals and resources flow to the baby, so that the transition from feeding off of a new kind of energy, which is oxygen, from the legacy system, which was feeding on your mother's blood, is not as abrupt. And apparently babies weather that much better. And so it's the same, like, how do we want to transition out of a fiat debt-based monetary system? Do we want to have a total collapse of the system and have to reboot it, which is kind of like this abrupt cutting of the umbilical cord, or when you slam the door in your parents' house and say, I don't want your pocket money. I'm just going to have my own little, I'm going to work at McDonald's and have my own, revenue. And, maybe it's a bit radical, maybe, maybe there are ways of doing it that are much smoother. So one way is if you convert the fiat money based on the relative theory of money. So the relative theory of money is a very interesting theory that has been thought up in 2010, right after the Bitcoin paper. Very symbolic. And yeah, I'll go back to the different metaphors I was giving to like self-governance. That's why blockchain and cryptocurrencies emerged in the first place. Like, it's not by chance that we have these technologies which allow for coordinating as humanity without having to go through centralized institutions and organizations. It's just the manifestation of, at our level, of this fractal pattern, where basically, the same as when you move out from your parents' house, you are self-governing yourself now as an individual. Obviously, your governance sort of scales upward towards society. And that's what we're also experiencing at humanity. Like, once we break free from the government placenta, then we'll be more under the sun's direct supervision, you could say. The whole solar system would be accountable to the solar system as a whole, which includes like being accountable to the Galactic Federation, or whatever you want to call those ETs that are there. Because it's like this chimpanzee, once he crawls out of that swamp, now he is no longer in a protected local ecosystem, which is the swamp. Now he's in a global ecosystem where his actions are going to reverberate on the lizard, on the snake, on whatever. If he starts climbing the trees and breaking all the branches, throwing them on the ground, or doing all kinds of crazy stuff, that's going to impact the whole ecosystem. And so now, before, when the chimp was still forming inside the swamp and before he crawled out of the swamp, then it's the swamp that was kind of he was accountable to the swamp, basically, and the ecosystem in the swamp. But now he's part of a bigger ecosystem, and that is reflected in his experience. And the same for us, right? So, relative theory of money. Very interesting kind of theory, where basically, imagine, so when in a debt-based monetary system, the monetary mass grows at about 10% per year. And that is basically because you have a rollover of credit into infinity. Whenever you take a credit, it's a creation of money. Whenever you repay credit, it is a destruction of money. So there's a loan that is created and it's gradually destroyed. That is when you repay it. And then a new loan is created here, and that loan is gradually destroyed as time goes by. And the new loan is created. And the thing is, you have to have more and more loans with more and more value that are created because of interest. Because of interest on debt. So imagine if you borrow 100 euros, and that's the only 100 euros in the economy, and it's at 10% interest. You have to repay it with 10% interest in a month. And it's not like compounding or anything, it's very simple. So you have to repay 110 euros next month. So you spend those 100 euros in the economy, and normally they go around, like you give the 100 euros to buy something like groceries or whatever, and then the people that produce the groceries need people to work in their farm to pick the groceries, and you go work there, and normally you would be paid as a salary these 100 euros back. But you have to repay 110. So how do you do it? The 10 euros don't exist in the economy. And the only way to do it is to borrow new money, to have a new debt that pays for your old debt, and that you repeat that pattern over and over and over again. And the average growth rate of the monetary mass is 10% per year. And so this economist said, okay, so you have a 10% growth of the monetary mass per year, which normally has to match the amount of growth in the economy growth. Because if these two are decoupled, that means that there's more and more money in the economy, but not as many goods in the economy. And that's when you get inflation, which is kind of the situation we're in right now. But that's another topic for another video, because it's more complex than that, because there's also supply shocks, all kinds of political reasons why we have inflation. But yeah, let's put that aside for now. The point is, he thought, okay, what if I take the total amount of money that is produced over 1 year and divided by the number of people that are inside a certain territory. Like you take Europe. Europe. Let's just say this is Europe. You have like people in here. And the money grows 10% per year, the monetary mass. Imagine if you divide that total money by the number of people and the number of days in a year. And you gave every single person, every day, what's called a universal dividend, UD, which is basically an equal share of the total monetary mass created. But here you just create it out of thin air. You don't really care. You just give it to people. And most economists would think, this guy's crazy, because that's going to just foment inflation and, it's going to be a crazy situation. But let's look at this. Money, what is it in the end? You could view it, and one way to view it is like a voting mechanism. Whenever you go to your baker and you give him 100 euros or 10 euros, you're basically, with that gesture, you're saying, I like your bread, please make more. And if that baker accumulates a lot of euros, then he can invest in buying a bigger stove, hiring new employees. And then, basically the money goes around and comes back to him. But it's that initial money that is like the signal for humans to put themselves into action. So if you imagine a society with millions and millions of people, they're doing nothing, they're just sitting around, and they have competences, and someone has an idea, like, let's build a cathedral. And people saying, what the hell? Why not achieving my idea, which is building a particle accelerator or something else? And money is kind of this voting mechanism which decides what gets built and what doesn't get built. Where money accumulates, that allows to transform or put a lot of humans into motion to transform reality in a certain specific way. Like, for instance, if money accumulates in the hands of the church, they can put a lot of humans into action to transform reality to build cathedrals. When money accumulates in the hands of someone like Elon Musk, it allows him to put a lot of humans into action to send a sports car into space. And that's just what money does, right? It's a way to prioritize which dreams or which aspirations, which ideas that humans have are built and which aren't. And the idea is the person that has the most money has his dreams or his ideas realized first, and then he pays those people with that money, and then the people that have the money that they've been paid with now can convince other humans to achieve their own ideas or aspirations or ways of shifting reality. And this works universally, because ultimately, even when you go into the grocery store and you're buying food, what you're doing is it's almost like you have prepaid these people to achieve or realize your need of being a Fed. So you don't have to like build a house for that to be true. It's just true all the time. And the problem is that the only way that you get access to this voting mechanism is via banks right now, or via a debt, which means 95 or more % of the money in circulation is debt money. So when you open your bank account and you look at your balance, that money that you see there is somebody else's debt that they need to repay at some point. And if you don't spend it, if most people didn't spend their money, then there would be a cascade of people that would default on their debt because they require you to spend it at a certain amount at a certain time. Otherwise, you can't reimburse the debt. Coming back to this very simple scenario, imagine if you went to buy groceries for 100 euros and the farmer actually said, you know what? I'm going to pick those fruits and vegetables myself. I'm not going to hire anyone to go and pick them for me. And you're desperately in need of those 100 euros because this is the only 100 euros in the economy. And in a month, you have to repay 110 euros. And so you're begging the farmer, please give me a job. Just pay me. Just release it. And the farmer says, I don't need you. I'm fine. I can do this all by myself. If he doesn't spend those 100 euros in the economy, if he keeps them sitting on his bank account, then you are going to be in default. You won't be able to repay your credit. You won't be able to repay your debt. So that's the first issue with this debt-based monetary system. The second issue is the banks decide who to give a loan to and who not to give a loan to, which means they are at the core of voting for what gets produced and what gets done. If the bank lends you money for your business as a baker, for instance, that initial investment typically comes from a bank. The very first stove that you buy comes from a bank. The very first flour or machines that you buy comes from a loan from a bank. The buying your business, for instance, the bricks and mortar, that comes from a loan from a bank. And so you have to convince your bank, first and foremost, that your business is going to be viable. But that means that I'm not saying that banks are not wise in that sense, because they always look at, whether your business is profitable and all that stuff. But profitability is only one metric. And you can also be very profitable by saying absolute crap, but just having a super marketing department that manages to brainwash people and convince them to buy your crap. And that would get financed by a bank, no problem, because they only care about, are you respecting local laws or not, selling, cocaine? And are you profitable? And the rest is like, not my business. I mean, if people want to buy crap, they can buy crap. What the relative theory of money does through the system of universal dividend that you get every day is to transform the entire economy into a giant permanent crowdfunding, which means every day, every citizen gets a new right to vote for what they deem is important as a product. So if they go and spend that universal dividend at the baker accumulates a lot of universal dividends, a lot of money, and can grow his business. If you spend it on a t-shirt, then it's the t-shirt business. But now, the problem with the understanding the relative theory of money is that in a debt-based monetary system, money enters the economy when a debt is created, and it exits the economy or is destroyed when it is repaid, when the debt is repaid. And if you look at goods and services, they have the same cycle. Like when you, when you buy a pair of shoes, after a certain amount of time, they also leave the economy. They don't last for 200 years, right? So the same with the debt. It doesn't last for 200 years. So that's the idea. You have to have a system that allows for the fluctuation of the monetary mass as to kind of be linked to the fluctuation in the number of goods and services available in the economy. If you have an imbalance between those two, then you have a problem. And what the relative theory of money does in a clever way is to come up with a way of counting wealth that is relative. Now, what does that mean? It means, it basically means that If everyone receives the same universal dividend, then instead of counting in monetary units like 100 euros, you count in universal dividend, one universal dividend. So let's say that a car costs 10,000 euros. Well, if one universal dividend is equal to 100 euros, you could also say that the car costs 100 universal dividends. That's the same. But what's nice here is that every year the universal dividend its value is redefined. So on the year one universal dividend equals 100 one universal dividend equals 100 euros. On year two, so this is year one. On year two, one universal dividend equals 110 euros. Because the monetary mass is growing by 10%, and so you're upgrading the value of your universal dividend by 10%. On year three, the universal dividend, one universal dividend is equal to 121 euros, and so on and so forth. What does this mean? It means that if you want to buy a car, it's still going to cost 100 universal dividends. That's the price that is displayed. But the amount of individual currency units that you'll have to spend now is going to be 12,100 euros and not 10,000 euros. Because now the universal dividend is worth 121 euros by convention. What that does is very nice. Since everybody continuously receives universal dividends, the old money that was produced is debased. Its value is less. And so that's the way that old money gets destroyed without having to actually destroy it, like via the debt mechanism. And what that allows you to do, and I have other videos which explains this in much more detail, is that the economy now is a reflection of each individual decisions that people make in the economy in a much more fair or distributed way, which means that, in many reflections around communities and all of that with gift economies and all kinds of reflections on what's a fair economic system is going to look like, there's just so much discussion on how do you set up the governance model for allowing humans to coordinate. And they typically have endless discussions around what to produce, what to buy, how to organize, how to do this or that, and they have to get together and discuss and agree. But money is a very easy or seamless mechanism for creating this kind of coherence at a global level. Every time you make a purchase, basically, you are sending a signal to the market, and normally the market reflects back to humanity the collective decisions that consumers make globally as to what they want to buy or purchase. Obviously, nowadays the system is kind of flawed in this system because you have all kinds of crazy marketing and advertising campaigns that are geared towards brainwashing people in behaving in predictable ways, because businesses don't like consumers that are like, should I buy Pepsi or Coke? Let's flip a coin. No, they want to have consumers that are locked into your product for life and will buy it until their dying breath. And so you have a nice, steady, recurring income stream, uninterrupted, so you can have a nice, steady growth. And you're going to create all kinds of systems or solutions or things for doing that, because your business, because it is based on, it is financed by debt, because it is within a debt-based monetary system, it cannot tolerate fluctuations in revenue. And that's what we'll address later on, is creating businesses that can fluctuate, where the revenue can fluctuate and they can still stay afloat. It's really important for the future of humanity. But the thing is, this very first layer of the monetary system is really, really important, Because ultimately, what you can solve just by simple individual daily decisions in terms of coordination for humanity, that's super important, because that's time that is not wasted on gathering together at 500 and trying to micromanage everything and deciding everything. And that's the problem of communism and these kind of systems where you want to try to micromanage what people are doing, is that you lose this spontaneous co-creation and things that are happening without any kind of authority that's bossing people around. Within capitalism, you don't need to micromanage startup entrepreneurs or people that are starting a business, but the rules of the game of capitalism, because it's in a debt-based monetary system, already kind of skew the game and influence the game in a certain number of ways. So money is not neutral. Because it is debt money, it is not neutral. And so this is just thinking of another system to replace the debt-based monetary system to achieve the same or better spontaneous coordination amongst humans without having to go through lengthy discussions and all that. And obviously for a community of 100 people or less, they can still have that luxury of sitting around and deciding who does what and what not. But when you have cities of 20,000 or 50,000 people that need to coordinate their actions, you need to think of how does all this function? And you cannot reach consensus between 50,000 people in an agora discussing every single minute detail of who does what. It's just impossible. But money can achieve that kind of coordination. It is just about defining the rules for that monetary system that achieve a certain number of outcomes that you want. And again, if you're interested in the relative theory of money, I have videos on my channels which explain this in much more detail. And I think this is just the first point. So it's going to be a video series. I'll probably put here video number 1. Oops. That's the first point. Then we'll address all kinds of other points, because ultimately, what is the goal here? So coming back to this thing here. Oops. The point is, what's the grand vision? The grand vision is to have not really city-states, but almost city-states. Decentralized cities that are linked up together in kind of a very complex network. And so each city is kind of autonomous. It has its own kind of local economy, its own entrepreneurs, maybe even its own currency based on the relative theory of money. And then you have higher systems which are based on more global technologies like Ethereum, which is planetary, or Bitcoin, which is also global and planetary, for macro coordination. But for local coordination, like between people in the same city, you can have these local currencies. Why do you need this? Because we need to mimic the resiliency of our own bodies. That's the kind of wisdom we're trying to replicate. Like if you cut yourself here in the hand, right? There's all kinds of mechanisms that are going to set themselves in motion to heal your hand. But for that to happen, you need to have resilient systems that are not so closely integrated and dependent on each other that if one fails, all of the other fails. And for instance, if you know a little bit something about finance, you know that this whole system, the way that it's been designed and the way that it's functioning now, is just a big, huge pile of Jenga. It's just plain Jenga. And you know that if you remove a certain number of blocks here, like the too big to fail banks, which is basically the blocks at the very bottom, that the whole tower comes crashing down. We've had it nearly happen in 2008, and thankfully society weathered that shock, not the banks, but society, which means the taxpayer. But you cannot that's not how it should be. That's not how it should function. Like if you cut your hand here, if you had to bleed your stomach and all of your single organs for that hand to heal, then you're a very poorly designed organism. And it's trying to have as least number of points of failure. So imagine if each of these decentralized cities is like a mini brain for this planet, where each human inside that city is like a neuron. And it has to function almost on autonomy, not autarky, but autonomy at the maximum level. And then whatever links it has with others, it is that part which it cannot achieve on its own. And we'll get to that later, but each city would have all the systems necessary for total self-governance. And these higher systems would also integrate AI, obviously, to identify kind of meta patterns for anticipating the future, anticipating problems, achieving coherence. That's especially important in the beginning, coherence. Because if one city sort of pollutes, let's say there's a river flowing between these two cities, and this city sort of throws chemicals into the river, and then downstream it pollutes this city, and they're kind of dead. That's not a very good situation. And AI can basically be rolled out to monitor all of the decisions that are being made at different city levels and assess, what the incidence is going to be between them, and allow these cities to discuss a minimum amount of coherence between their actions without compromising this, spontaneous self-organization, and especially flexibility in the rules that they come up with. Because for humanity, the big challenge now is surfing between total freedom, which spirals into chaos, and coherence, global coherence. That is, your body is a coherent envelope for everything that's happening on the inside. But that doesn't mean your stomach is the same as your liver, is the same as your heart, is the same as your brain. They're each very, very unique. They serve totally different purposes, but they click together in a way that is coherent and that allows them collectively to have experiences that they could never even dream of if they didn't achieve that kind of level of coherence. And today we're being pitched that it's either freedom and chaos versus security or survival. Hence, the World Economic Forum and AI basically taking control of humanity and telling everyone how much water they can consume today, how many zucchinis they can have, how many carrots they should eat, and where they'll have to sleep, and rationalize resources and all this stuff. But that's like a teenager being locked up in his room and his parents saying, now you're on you only have this much of pocket money and we'll control you because you're crazy and you're not capable of living on your own. Or putting a baby that's 9 months old inside the womb into a kind of stasis and saying, now you're going to stay in this womb and we're going to control all the resources that you consume so that it's all in balance inside the womb. I mean, that's silly, right? But so we need to achieve coherence at the planetary level as a superorganism, but keeping the maximum amount of freedom without sinking into chaos, because that is the richness, the very reason why we are so diverse, and there's so many different political systems, economic systems, systems of organization, of governance, of all kinds of things. That's why you have so many different political parties also and different ideologies. And so it's a way to keep that diversity, but to think of systems like these self-governing, cities where you can have plenty of experimentations with different systems that creates diversity and yet achieves a certain amount of harmony and coherence at the global level, facilitated by certain tools like AI. So you have to have harmony within these little bubbles. And then from that harmony, locally, local homeostasis of all of these things, then you have these meta kind of systems that put these together in a way that is coherent. And what does that do? So I'll just finish with this point. Why would this system be any better than any other? And it's again about these timelines, these timelines for the future. Like, we're 2024 and, channelers will say there's one timeline that goes here, one that goes there, one that goes here. If you think of a timeline where the World Economic Forum puts humanity in a kind of stasis and an AI dictates what we should or shouldn't do, we have chips implanted in our brains, and we all obey this kind of P-brain World Economic Forum leaders that know what's best for the common good, because climate change and all kinds of resource scarcity, scaremongering. How does that timeline? How heavy is it? I'm going to say how heavy. And heavy is a very strategically chosen term. It means how many different possible alternate timelines or diverse experiences can you have from that kind of situation or scenario. And that's like coming back to the swamp idea with an organism forming inside of it, right? If you cut off both its arms and legs, what are the possible timelines that organism can experience in the future? Can it climb a tree? No. Can it, crawl out of the swamp? No. Can it, it's just going to float there in the swamp. Like imagine you have a lizard and you cut off all of it doesn't have a tail, it doesn't have hands, it doesn't have feet, it doesn't have nothing. It's just there, it just has a mouth. So it can swallow things that haphazardly are in the swamp and survive there. Yay. So none of these timelines exist. Now imagine a situation again where this becomes a reality. The planet is basically transformed into these little bubbles of mini brains, which are like zones in your brain, like areas in your brain that are interconnected with each other, but that do function autonomously. Which means that if one suffers a major cataclysm, this can quickly either it can be repaired or it can be replaced. And basically, there's no single point of failure. How many different experiences can humanity have from that kind of timeline? And how many directions and how many potential experiences can humanity have from that kind of timeline? Incalculable. It's like right now with your body, you can dance, you can jump out the window, you can go and grab food, you can play a sport. The amount of experiences that you can have as a human and that reverberate into all of your parts, because whenever you play football, it involves every single one of your cells has to modify its state in some way to account for what you're doing on the outside. So my goal is precisely that, is to think of an architecture for the future of humanity that we're transitioning towards that affords the highest possible range of experiences available to us. And that's what any parent would wish for their baby when they're born. They're not going to say, oh, I'm going to design my baby so that he has super big, thick legs so that he's going to be the best at football, and then we'll have tiny little dwarf little arms and a tiny little head because you don't really need that when you play soccer. And he's just going to be a soccer freak, That's limiting the potential experiences of your baby, of your child, to just one thing, one sport. Of course, yeah, he's going to be the best at soccer. But is that what you want to do? Or do you want for your child to have the highest availability of experiences, or ranges of experiences available to the child when they're born, and then that kind of, gradually restricts as the baby ages and makes decisions and choices in their own life, which stirs them towards having more of one experience than of another. But you don't want that range to be closed at birth. You want it to be as open as possible, right? Because that's what you want for your child. You want him to be able to experience as many range of possible experiences as possible, and then from that he can choose whatever he wants. And that's the same that I want for humanity as part of this collective superorganism, is that its experiences that will reverberate into individual experiences at our level, that superorganism's experiences, a range of experiences, are as wide as possible. Because if I were to say, scratch this architecture, let's just go for whatever the Pleiadians advise. And I'm just saying this to tease you, because most of these ETs, that's exactly what they're saying. They're saying, well, yeah, sure, we can talk to you about all their advanced technologies and whatever, but please do your thing, do humanity. Your materialist science, cause and effect, 3D, matrix, your bodies, your biological bodies, everything, it's all perfect, it's all great. Sure, you can take inspiration from us, from certain things here and there, and it's like, a child or a baby, or a child that once is born, and it asks, various other adults questions like, it sees a soccer player and says like, oh, wow, what is that sport? Please tell me more. But it's not like saying, oh, I love soccer, I'm just going to cut my arms because I don't need them. No. And the same for humanity. It's not like, oh, let's abandon all our belief systems and opt for whatever the Pleiadians are saying. So that was just one point in my long list of suggestions for how to achieve a global planetary superorganism that is resilient and yet achieves coherence and has the widest amount of available experiences available to it on the other side of the veil. And so hopefully you like this. Don't forget to like, share, subscribe, and I'll continue this video at a future date. Bye, guys.